Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Tara. I am a software engineer at FutureLearn. If you don't know about FutureLearn, we're a social learning company, and you can access online courses from institutions and universities from around the world. So this isn't anything from business to teaching to technology. So at FutureLearn, we use Webpack. Who here uses Webpack at their place of work or on personal projects? A lot of people. Okay, can I ask another question? Do you like working with Webpack? Yeah, that is what I thought. And a disclaimer, I actually wrote this talk just to force myself to learn Webpack a little bit more, because it's so hard to understand. And I've kind of renamed this talk in the process, actually, to Webpack, the good, the bad, and the downright ugly. With the aim still to explore why it is that we choose to use Webpack in the first place, and then highlight some of the difficulties that I've had learning it along the way. So I started using Webpack almost 4 years ago now. It's been around for a long time, but it's kind of a thing where you set it up, you leave it for a little bit, maybe you need to change something, and then you leave it for a bit more. Something breaks, you have to patch it, and then you leave it a little bit more, and you don't continuously work on it. I'm not sure how it works for you, but as long as it works, everyone's happy, and then you just don't really touch it again. And the first time I heard about this thing called Webpack, way back when, was when people were considering bringing it into our project. And someone in my team who was like, well, I'm not really sure about Webpack, because it's a black box, and nobody really understands what's going on the inside. And what he was saying is that Webpack does a lot of weird stuff that you have little control over, especially years and years ago. And had seen experiences using it where he'd seen unexpected issues come up and wasn't sure how to work with them. And it turned out those issues had cropped up because of the way Webpack was compiling his code. And for whatever reason, this sentence has stuck with me for all this time. So why do we use it? Because we used to use things like gulp and grunt, task runners, to help us automate our manual tasks. Things like compiling our SAS files or including JS files on our pages, or deployment. And Webpack allows us to do that and a lot more with less setup, depending on your projects. So let's dig into what Webpack can let us do. Starting with the main question, what even is it? Well, if you go straight to their homepage, they describe themselves as a module bundler. And if you look at their webpage, you'll see on the right, it will take anything that you give it, any type of module or chunk of code or input from a starting point, and stitch it all together in some way to give you some output on the right-hand side. And the thing that Webpack does in the middle, depends on the configuration, depends on how you set it up. I mean, it's quite literally a black box in the middle. So let's look at an example configuration file. So generally, you'll have some sort of entry point. So this tells Webpack where do you want it to start looking, where in your code do you want to start looking for the code. And then with the output, where do you want to put that, and what should it be called? The interesting bit comes in the module section, when you can start creating rules for how you want Webpack to treat your code that you give it. So this rule here says, if you come across a CSS file, do these two things, use these two loaders with it. And it starts from the end and works backwards. So it'll first apply the CSS loader, and then after it's done that, it'll apply the style loader. The CSS loader in this case changes your CSS into a string, and the style loader will inject it into the head of your page inside style tags. We've also got another rule here. This will look out for any JavaScript file that it comes across in your application and run it against the Babel loader. So if you're transpiling your code back into ES5, that's what you'll use Babel for. And then you can also add the exclude key here that says if you come across any JavaScript file inside your node modules directory, just ignore it completely. Like, I don't need to think about that. Then we also have plugins. So where your where your loaders look at modules, your plugins rely on the hooks provided by Webpack, and at this point it gets the best access to the execution process. So we'll talk about one of these later, but this happens after the loaders. And then finally, we have the resolve section in this example, where if you want Webpack to do anything funky with its module resolution algorithm, you can add that here for how Webpack finds the correct file that you want to import. So that's just a common example for a small project. And depending on the projects that you set up, it's probably a lot more complex, and it can change dramatically depending on the project that you're building. So let's say that we wanted to build an application. Let's work through this process. I have to make it about someone good, so I chose Beyonce. So let's make an app that will build us a Beyonce performance. So we'll set it up a bit like this. We've got 4 pieces, and this is probably quite similar to the way you write modern JavaScript today. It's clearer to split up our code into small chunks, so it's easier to understand and review and maintain. And it's so small that we're going to have a single entry point down here in performance.js. And what Webpack will do next is it will convert this into a dependency graph. And Webpack builds a dependency graph to describe how all of your modules relate to one another and depend on one another. So usually in the case of web development, it's defined through a series of requires or imports, and that describes the relationships between your files. So let's say a JavaScript file imports another JavaScript file, which goes on to import another one and might import some CSS. And Webpack, like I said, can work with any type of file that you give it, as long as you've told it what to do with the files using your different loaders and in the rules. And essentially, the dependency graph is a huge blob of JSON with loads of information about every module that it comes across in your application and how it should treat it. So this can get really complex with bigger projects. And the more chunks that you add and the more entry points that you add, it can get more complex. And if you're interested in seeing what this JSON looks like, if you run this command, Webpack with a JSON flag, it will create a file for you called stats.json. And you can see like how huge this file is and all the information that it stores about your project. And also, if you go to the link at the bottom, it breaks down exactly all the keys in that JSON file to tell you what exactly each of it means. So a small snippet of what this looks like in the little Beyonce application. So you can see at the top, it's looking at the song.js module, which has been called from this issuer here in the performance.js. And the whole thing from this issuer path was inside an index.js module. And that is like a super small snippet. The whole file for 4 modules was 684 lines long. So like there's a lot that Webpack is doing on the internals. So let's go back to the project. So in the case of bundling our code specifically into one JavaScript file, technically we don't need to use Webpack to do this. This is supported by just adding type module to our script tags. We can tell our browser that when you import our code, we're using modules here. So we don't actually need Webpack for that main bit. But type module is only supported in your browsers. And there is a performance impact to that, because when your browser goes and fetches the first file, it then sees the import statements for the other files, then has to go and fetch those files. If there are more import statements, it'll have to keep going until it finds all the files that you need. But there are lots of other benefits that come with Webpack, if not just for helping the performance of having your JavaScript code in one bundle. So let's start with some of the good things that Webpack does do. And one of the things that's working for us at FutureLearn is the fact that it supports multiple configuration files. So we can set up different configurations for different environments and different browsers. So what we're in the process of doing at FutureLearn is saying that actually most of our learners are using modern browsers. So we don't need to use the Babel loader to transpile that JavaScript code back to ES5. We can just give them the code that we write. But we can also say we still care about our learners that use IE11, and we can make another bundle that does transpile our code into ES5. So now we end up with two versions of our code, one for older browsers and one for new browsers. And Webpack makes it really easy to do that just by making two configuration files that treats our code differently. And then at build time, Webpack will create those bundles. And then it's up to us to decide how we choose to serve our learners the old versus the newer bundle. Another great thing about Webpack is tree shaking. So tree shaking drops unused pieces of code based on static code analysis. So Webpack does this as it goes through the dependency graph. So going back to our Beyonce application, let's say that our venue.js code exports two functions. One of them is a location function that's just returning two strings in this case. And the other one is a function that returns the size of the venue. And then our performance JavaScript at the top imports from the song, and on the second line, it just imports the location from the venue JavaScript and then returns that in the performance function. And if we look specifically at the location here, in venue we export both location and size and make that available, but we're only using location. By default, Webpack will just remove size and all the code in the size functionality from the bundle that it creates and gives to your users, which is great because we don't want to have to give the users code that's not going to be run, and that's really good for our performance. And you get this for free by just using ES 2015 modules and Webpack together. Another great thing about Webpack is code splitting. So depending on how you do this, you can really improve page performance again, because you can get a quicker load time by providing assets that are smaller. So if you look at the Webpack docs, it talks about code splitting in three ways: entry points, preventing duplication, and dynamic imports. So entry points is specific to the code that you're writing and the code that will be used in different places. But it's all about creating more smaller bundles, and that's up to you to do manually and to decide where to split your code. Whereas preventing duplication, we'll take a look at a little bit more. So let's say we go back to our Beyonce application, and instead of creating one bundle called performance.js, we're now creating three. We're going to have one bundle for each of these JavaScript files. And this is something that we kind of do at FutureLearn, not related to Beyonce, but we do so we can cache our files individually. And then if we change one, it doesn't invalidate the whole bundle and only one of them, which makes it easier for our learners. So let's say these three files use the same code from flawless.js, and each one of the three files is reusing the same code. And when Webpack goes through these three entry points, it includes those three files 3 times over. So when it gets to your browser, we've created 3 script tags, and each one of them has code specifically to the outfit, specifically to the song, and specifically to the venue. But each one of them also has the same code duplicated 3 times in the flawless.js code. So this is a good use case for code splitting. So one of the plugins that Webpack has is the split chunks plugin to help us with duplication. And when you use this, what you end up with is a 4th bundle and essentially a 4th script tag on your page if it's a web application. And the split chunks plugin will spot shared modules, duplicated modules, and pull that out into a module of its own. So we can import Flawless once onto the page, and it will be reused by each of your other entry points. And it's a great way to prevent duplication and make sure that the code that you're sending over to your users is a lot smaller. The third thing that they were talking about on the Webpack docs around code splitting is dynamic imports. So dynamic imports are in the proposal stage of ECMAScript, and it allows you to import modules on the fly. And you can use it in imported browsers because it gets transpiled down to promises by Babel. So it looks a little bit like this. You can give it any condition and say that you only want to import your module based on that condition. So in this case, if Beyonce is flawless, then go and import the flawless module. And all you need to do with the import function is pass in the location of where that module lives. And then you'll also spot the magic comment here inside the import call, where it's called Webpack chunk name, and we've given it the name flawless. So this is completely optional, actually, but Webpack here will take the module that you've passed in and make a separate bundle for it. And it treats, so it makes a separate bundle for your flawless code, and then when you request it, it will go and request that function, that bundle. Although the Webpack chunk name is optional, if you don't give it, it'll give it a random name. So you want to give it a name to help with debugging so you can find the code later, and also to help with caching because it'll keep changing when it gets built, and then that name will keep being invalidated. So to give you an example of what this looks like, so we still have 3 entry points, outfit, song, and venue, but now the use of the flawless code is conditional against some whatever logic. So if we decide, actually, we do need that code, we can dynamically pull in the flawless JS code on the fly at runtime if that condition is true. But you can do a lot of things with Webpack. Hashing, minification, it's just great for managing assets and files and modules. And because of the variety of loaders and plugins that the community have built means you can do a lot of different powerful things. But, like, Webpack can be painful. And there are a number of reasons to this. I think firstly, it's just a high barrier to entry. It is quite an advanced topic, Webpack, and getting it set up in the first place can be really difficult to do. And I think the problem with this is that if you work with junior developers, it's really hard to find a way that you can make this accessible to them and help them to pick it up straight away, as they're already trying to learn a number of other things to do with the projects that you work on. We've also seen issues with breaking versions, updates. So this is probably a rare thing, but we were using Webpack 3, and that probably a little while ago updated to Webpack 4. And I mentioned the split chunks plugin earlier, but Webpack 3 used to have a common chunks plugin, which did something really similar. When Webpack upgraded to version 4, that didn't exist anymore. So although we wanted to keep up to date with some of the latest versions of Webpack, it was a real big project to understand how this new plugin worked, how we should get rid of the old one, use the new one, and keep everything going while still trying to ship products and features. Because we want to be able to use Webpack in the most efficient and performant way. The third thing where we've seen issues with Webpack is just the painfulness of trying to find issues in the first place. Trying to hunt through Webpack and seeing issues where plugins are actually incompatible with each other. Those kind of issues are quite hard to find, and they can give some weird side effects, which brings me to the one downright ugly thing that we've seen with using Webpack in the past. And that's just having to build in lots of weird workarounds. You can't just use it in a straightforward manner. Depending on what you're building, what you're creating, you have to tweak it in lots of interestingly and quirky ways. So we found that one of the plugins we were using was conflicting with a different plugin, and having to do some research and see some conversations in issue threads. We found that we literally had to degrade one of the plugins we were using because of the fact that it was conflicting with a different one. So we had to knock it back a version. And that's just one of the many workarounds that we've implemented with trying to get Webpack working for us. So overall, do the benefits of Webpack outweigh the negatives? I don't know. I mean, I have no clue. It's definitely up to you, up to the project that you work on, but I totally recommend learning about it. It's been like an interesting process for me. And if you do go on to learn about it, there are some tools and resources that I recommend. The first one is obviously the Webpack documentation. It has a lot of detail about all the things that Webpack can do and how to use it. The second is the Webpack Book. This is on the Survive.js website, and it kind of works alongside the Webpack docs, and it goes into everything in a lot more detail, and I found that really, really useful, actually. One of the tools that we use is something called the Webpack Visualizer, and I think what's great about this is the demo project that they have, and you can see, you give it your like statistics JSON, which I mentioned earlier, and you can see the biggest part of this project here compared to that little part there. This big section is just the node modules, and I think that's an average project. And then that little bit at the top is the source code that they've written. But you can really see like how your project is broken up into the different modules that you have. And if you're still a little bit unsure about Webpack, you're not convinced, I mean, there are alternatives that do similar things. So I haven't used any of the alternatives, I just know that they exist. So there's Parcel.js that you might have used, and apparently it's very similar to Webpack, but you don't have to write any configuration whatsoever. It looks at your code and just knows what to do, which I think is magic. And I'll have to give it a go and let you know. There's also Rollup, where unlike Parcel, you still have to write configuration to get it set up. And apparently this is good for libraries, but has limited support for other file types like images and CSS. And then the final one that I found out, thanks to Reddit, is Fusebox, which is meant to be really performant and fast, and good for TypeScript users. So although I've talked about Webpack, you're not limited to Webpack as a tool. There are lots of other options available. So I definitely recommend having a look into how you can use it to help build your code in a more performant way. Thank you for listening.